Slightly this evening, in terms of us doing an educational program outside. If you get a lot of people in there, if you've been to these things before, it gets a little warm, and it sounded like a nice night, and so we did it out here. You are also on camera, or at least your audio will be recorded. So if any of you brought any loud, cell phones or drums or something, please keep that to yourself. But anyway. My name is Gareth Evans. I'm the director here at the Bellamy Mansion Museum. Thank you all for coming out. Usually I ask first, how many people have been here before? Okay, good. Then I don't necessarily need to introduce the place to you, but I will say, if you have not, or indeed if you have, please feel free. 1859 Slave Quarters is open. The mansion itself is open. There is an art show inside. You do not feel the need to hurry off after tonight's program. Take a look around. You will see inside that we did get our roof removed by the lovely Hurricane Florence on top of the Belvedere up there, and water in all 5 floors, which was quite the mess. So if you go in there, you will see a lot of damp looking plaster and damp looking floors and other things. They're not damp now, the floors I should say. Thanks to KFU Museum, who loaned us their dehumidifiers, we seem to be in decent shape. But we are, one of the reasons I mentioned that is because we have donation jars, and I'm remiss in my job if I don't mention that that's where the money is going tonight. One of the reasons that we were excited to have this program with Dr. Janken is the fact that there is possibly a link here to this site in terms of some of the story you will hear. In 1972, arson. Somebody tried to burn down the Bellamy House in February of that year, and later on in August of that year, somebody did, or a building of the Bellamy family, one of the sons' houses, which is just across the street at 6th and Market, did burn down. And as you will hear from the story, that is something which was a focal point of what we're going to be talking about this evening. So there's a link there. No one was ever caught for the arson. And there are multiple ways of theorizing what happened at that time. But nobody knows. So it kind of fits in a speculative way to the history we're discussing. Going around this evening, and I think we'll pass this around in a couple of seconds if we haven't, right there, Leslie's got them, some images and newspaper clippings and things like that, and a map of where all the events took place. There are 2 sets of them going around. They'll keep going around all evening. You take a look and pass them on. And last thing I think I'll bring up is that at the end of this, if you haven't got a copy of the book, it's excellent and thoroughly worth a reading for one of the most important things that ever happened in Wilmington. The book is right here, and of course you can buy it and get it signed. With all that being said, Dr. Kenneth Jenkin is a professor of African American Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. He's taught since 1991, author of 3 books, including the current one under discussion, the Wilmington Ten. He was born and raised in Los Angeles, got his bachelor's and master's in history from Hunter College and City University in New York, and a PhD from Rutgers. And he lives in Chapel Hill with his wife, who is here somewhere, right there. And has 2 kids now in university. And, well, with that, I will let him tell you the rest of the story. Thank you.
I can't hold something and talk at the same time. Can you hear me? Can you hear me without it? Okay, fine. I'll stay here. And good evening, everyone. I want to thank the Bellamy Mansion Museum for inviting me. I got an email from Gareth, I don't know when it was, last spring, I think it was, saying, do you ever come down to Wilmington and, would you like to talk down here at some time? And I said, yes, let's set a date. And here I am. And I am really very happy to be here. And I was pleasantly surprised that, that this program wasn't postponed, given all the weather that you have suffered under. And so I also want especially to thank you all for coming out and putting aside whatever whatever problems or whatever cleanup you have to do, and to come out and learn something about the Wilmington Ten. So thank you, Bellamy Mansion, thank you, Gareth, and thank you to you. You all deserve a round of applause for yourself. So let me give one to you. So I want to talk about the Wilmington Ten. I have about, a half hour, 40 minutes to talk, and then I'm happy to entertain whatever questions and discussion that you want to have. So I guess I'll just get started here. On the last day of 2012, Governor Beverly Perdue, who was in her final days of office, made a highly anticipated announcement. After carefully considering all the circumstances in the 40-year-old case of the Wilmington Ten, the governor found no basis for their convictions. The state's conduct in the case was so outrageous that she issued pardons of innocence to Ben Chavis, Reginald Epps, Jerry Jacobs, James McCoy, Wayne Moore, Marvin Patrick, Ann Shepard, Connie Tyndall, Willie Earl Vereen, and Joe Wright. Their trial, she said, was unfair and was a misappropriation of justice. The governor's actions culminated a nearly 2-year intensive effort led by journalist Cash Michaels and supported by the state's black media and social justice organizations to clear the names of the Wilmington Ten. The campaign brought to the public's attention a case that many had forgotten or only generally remembered as having something to do with violence and conflict over school desegregation, or perhaps they even confused it with the Wilmington race riot of 1898. Yet the Wilmington Ten was one of the most significant civil rights and civil liberties cases of the African American freedom struggle of the 1960s and 1970s. This evening, I'll reacquaint us with the case and the national and international campaign to free them. I'm going to address 3 general questions. First, what occurred in Wilmington in 1971 that climaxed in civil unrest and acts of violence? Why were 10 individuals, most of them high school students, framed for crimes emanating from those disturbances? And how did a movement develop to deliver them justice, and what was the significance of that movement for our understanding of the African American freedom struggle? Those are the 3 broad questions that I want to touch on today. In February of 1971, black high school students in Wilmington had reached their limit. They were angry at the process by which the new Hanover County school system implemented a federal court order to desegregate. It was a process in which neither they nor their parents had had a say. They resented that the plan shut down Black Williston High School in 1968 and dispersed its students to 2 majority white high schools. They had had enough of the shabby treatment they received at these 2 high schools, in which they were effectively unwanted outsiders. They demanded change expressed in new rhetoric. They issued a manifesto called What We Want, What We Believe, whose title was appropriated from the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, which in turn was borrowed from the Nation of Islam's Muslim program. Their demands included the observation of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, a Black Studies curriculum, and guest speakers relevant to African Americans, an end to the exclusion of and discrimination against black students in extracurricular activities, the hiring of black coaches for their school's athletic teams, an end to the suspension and expulsion of black students who ran afoul of school administrators while white students were treated with leniency, an end to harassment of black students by police called to campus, an end to physical attacks by white teachers, and keeping non-student whites out of the schools and preventing them from provoking fights with black students. The school board rejected these demands, and the students began a boycott of classes. They announced their actions in the language of Black Power in another leaflet. Black students in New Hanover County schools have been the victims of white oppression and racism, they wrote. They have been enslaved not only physically, but mentally. We will be respected, not as colored nor Negro, but as black students. So hear our plea, oppressed black brothers and sisters. Join us tomorrow, February 3rd, 1971, when we walk out of the slave masters' classrooms at 12 noon. Power, peace, and liberation to all black people. The students' boycott headquarters was the Gregory Congregational Church, whose minister welcomed them after several other churches turned them down. The minister quickly realized that the students required more expertise than he possessed. He called the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, which sent political and organizational assistance in the person of its experienced organizer, Ben Chavis. Chavis worked to help the students sharpen their demands and build community support. The first few days of the boycott consisted of public demonstrations at the school board, Black history lessons in the church annex, and strategy sessions. Despite a high participation rate in the boycott, the school board continued to reject the students' demands. The boycott attracted the attention of the Rights of White People organization, the ROWP, which drove armed caravans by the boycott headquarters at night and shot at participants and the church building. As the police and mayor did nothing to protect the church or its occupants, the violence only escalated. Chavis and the Gregory minister, Eugene Templeton, pleaded for police protection and an evening curfew, but they were rebuffed. The drive-by shootings continued. A Black Baptist minister trying to arrange a peaceful resolution to the conflict was shot by the ROWP. In response, young black Wilmingtonians, including some who were in the Army and stationed at nearby Fort Bragg, rallied to defend the church. There was retaliatory violence in the form of arson against white-owned businesses by still unidentified parties. Although it is important to note that some of the more publicized incidents were proven or strongly suspected to be arson for insurance and not set by protesting blacks. On a Saturday evening, February 6th, someone set fire to Mike's Grocery, a mom-and-pop store a few blocks from Gregory Congregational Church. That same night, police shot and killed a student leader who went to investigate the blaze. And the next morning, Harvey Cumber, a local white supremacist, drove through police lines, got out of his car, and prepared to shoot a gun at the church. He was shot and killed by someone also as yet unidentified. It was this incident, and not the attacks on the church and the ROWP's threats, that caused the city to take action. The mayor declared a curfew and called in the State Highway Patrol and National Guard, who stormed the church. The boycott was broken, and students returned to school. Martial law imposed an uneasy calm on the city. Not peace, mind you, because there were continued skirmishes in the schools and community for some time. The rights of white people continued their provocations for months, although they were slightly toned down. And there definitely was not a climate of justice. In fact, during one court proceeding immediately after the February violence, a judge chastised the Wilmington chief of police for not acting more forcefully against the boycotters in Gregory Church. If he had been in charge, he lectured, he would have stormed the church like Lieutenant Calley did in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Wilmington was not the only place in North Carolina to experience school conflict. Around the same time, across the state as far east as New Bern and at least as far west as Lenoir, clashes erupted over school desegregation. African American students and parents asserted claims for equal education on a desegregated basis, and whites struggled to manage the desegregation process to their advantage by controlling, for example, which schools in a given district would close, or which teachers and administrators would be hired in the desegregated schools and which would be let go, or how racial friction on school property would be handled. In most instances around the state, the school battles were limited. There were hallway fights, or a protest, or a march, or perhaps a short and spontaneous walkout, and then a return to normal. A few places were different. Wilmington was one of them. Greensboro was another. What made them different was the existence of organizations that had well-developed critiques of the racial order. In Wilmington and in eastern North Carolina, the leading group was the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ. In Greensboro and a few other cities in the state, the Youth Organization for Black Unity, or YOBU, was most prominent. Not surprisingly, their networks overlapped. Their critiques connected racial oppression to the government's wider domestic policies, including the functioning of the criminal justice system. They linked the fight against the oppression of African Americans with the fight against the United States' support for apartheid and Portuguese colonialism in southern Africa. Some critiques identify capitalism as the source of racial oppression. In addition to propagandizing for a radical overhaul of American society, these organizations were exceptionally skilled at finding allies in the struggle and developing specific demands that they could support, even if those allies could not readily support the long-range goals. In other words, these organizations were more than sects. They were successfully building popular movements. The combination of radical analysis and practical success caught the attention of North Carolina of North Carolina and federal authorities, who planned to trap them in the same type of COINTEL program, that's the counterintelligence program, that had ensnared the Black Panther Party. We know from documents made available after Freedom of Information Act requests that the State Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents, all of them had been tracking Ben Chavis and the situation in Wilmington, especially after the events of February of 1971. The opportunity to begin to frame Chavis and whoever else was necessary to make the charges stick arrived in May of 1971, just a few months after the violence around Gregory Church. Alan Hall, a participant on the margins of the school boycott, was arrested on unrelated charges. He asked Chavis and a local black nationalist organization under his guidance to help him. When they said they did not have the resources to assist, an angry Hall fell out with them. An ambitious district attorney named Jay Stroud took advantage of Hall's dispute with Chavis and recruited him to be the centerpiece of what became his case against the Wilmington Ten. Stroud first talked to Hall when he was arrested, but before he was charged with the crime. That in itself was highly unusual, as district attorneys did not routinely get involved at that early a stage in a case. Stroud secured from Hall a statement implicating himself, Chavis, and others in the murder of Harvey Cumber and the burning of Mike's. Over the next several months, while Hall languished in jail, waiting for a trial and sentencing, Stroud met Hall several times to refine and embellish his story. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agent Bill Walden became involved too. Walden had experience fabricating charges against black radicals. He was instrumental, for example, in recruiting informants and paying them to lie about Chavis and Jim Grant, who went to prison as one of the Charlotte Three. Once the story was massaged to Stroud's and Walden's satisfaction, Walden wrote it up and Hall signed it, and this became the basis for the charges against the Wilmington Ten. In March of 1972, Chavis and 16 others were arrested on charges connected with the burning of Mike's grocery. Jay Stroud manipulated the process of charging them. He indicated that he would consider not charging some of the big fish, he said, in order to provoke little fish to turn on those who Stroud believed were more involved and more dangerous. The district attorney ultimately decided to bring charges against 12 of the 17 who were arrested, only 7 of whom ended up on trial as the Wilmington Ten. The three remaining members of the Wilmington Ten were added later, while the charges against the others were not pursued. At the probable cause hearing, Alan Hall was the prosecution's principal witness. His testimony was erratic. He could not accurately describe the geography around Gregory Church and Mike's. So, for example, he swore that he shot a gun at police when he was standing at the corner of 5th Street and 6th Street, even though those streets ran parallel. Sometimes during his testimony, he said he was at the church and heard Chavis agitate the student boycotters to commit crimes. But he also said that he was not there, but rather was somewhere else. When he was confronted with this inconsistency between his testimony and his signed statement, Hall said that he had verbally made corrections to the statement several times, and that Jay Stroud had written them down. Therefore, Hall insisted, there was no inconsistency. The only way to tell, though, was to look at the so-called amended statement. But Stroud refused to turn it over to the defense, and the judge agreed. The defense was thereby deprived of an opportunity to probe Hall's veracity and credibility. During cross-examination, Hall jumped off the witness stand and lunged at Ferguson. Hall's entire performance and the argument over whether the so-called amended statement should be available to the defense were repeated at trial. In the former instance, the judge blamed Ferguson in the presence of the jury for Hall's outburst, and in the latter instance, the judge continued to keep the so-called amended statement away from the defense. District Attorney Stroud's case consisted primarily of a single eyewitness who definitely identified the 10 as the people who conspired to burn Mike's. In this, Alan Hall was sure, but otherwise he could not get his story straight. For his testimony, Hall received special treatment. He was led out of jail to visit his mother at her home. He was allowed to visit his girlfriend, who was brought by police escort from her home in Asheville. While he prepared his testimony in advance of the trial, he stayed at a hotel at the beach and then in a beach cottage. And he received a reduction of the prison sentence he was serving. No jury was ever allowed to hear about these emoluments, which had the practical effect of propping up Hall's credibility. Stroud's case was shaky, and it was too chancy to him to let the case depend on Hall's testimony and credibility. Stroud had to devise another way to ensure victory. He worked to rig the jury. The trial opened early in June of 1972 in Burgaw, the seat of Pender County. The defense had successfully argued for a change of venue owing to the racial polarization and inflammation and prejudicial news coverage in New Hanover County. Over the course of a week, Stroud and James Ferguson fought to seat a jury under presiding Judge Joshua James. In such a controversial case, the judge seemed intent on weeding out potential jurors whose minds were polluted by adverse publicity or who were already convinced that at least some of the defendants were guilty. Judge James seemed determined that both the state and the defendants would receive a fair trial. By the end of that first week, given which jurors had been accepted by both sides and who remained in the jury pool, it was a numerical certainty that a majority of the jury would be African American. Realizing that this crucial part of a trial would not go his way, Stroud faked an illness. Court adjourned early that Friday. On the following Monday, Stroud feigned illness, and the prosecution requested a mistrial. In notes to himself weighing the pros and cons of being sick and requesting a mistrial, Stroud wrote that a new trial had the positive outcome of getting a new judge, getting a jury more to his liking, and help from a newly created position of special state prosecutor, who specialized in controversial and high-profile cases. He also noted that a new trial would also give him a chance to try Ann Shepard separately. And this would be in his favor because it would keep out of the trial of Chavis a damning piece of evidence, a letter that Alan Hall sent to Shepard from jail that threatened her if she did not back up his story about Chavis and the firebombing of Mike's Grocery. Evidently, not aware of Stroud's musings and believing him to be seriously ill and unable to carry on the business of a trial, the judge granted a mistrial. Just as Stroud expected, he was both better prepared and had a more sympathetic judge when the new trial convened in September of 1972. Special Superior Court Judge Robert Martin was a political appointee, not an elected judge. Part of his job was to travel the state and try racially charged cases. For example, he presided over the travesty that was the trial of the murderers of Dickie Marrow in Oxford, North Carolina in 1970, which is at the center of Tim Tyson's memoir, Blood Done Sign My Name. Martin was an acolyte of the segregationist gubernatorial candidate Beverly Lake. During the Wilmington Ten trial, Judge Martin had lunch with the state attorney general, Robert Morgan, whose office was overseeing the prosecution. During jury selection in the second Wilmington Ten trial, he seated jurors who plainly stated that they had made up their minds that Chavis and other defendants were guilty. He seated jurors who were relatives of law enforcement officers and National Guardsmen who were on duty in Wilmington during the uprising. He regularly prevented Attorney Ferguson from probing prospective jurors' racial attitudes. Martin's actions abetted District Attorney Stroud's plans to exclude blacks from the jury and to include white supremacists. So if you're looking at the thing that's being passed around, you'll see a list of J. Stroud's jury notes where he talks about who he wants on the jury and who he doesn't. So let me give you some, if you don't have it, let me give you some of the comments that he wrote in his own handwriting, which only came to light in 2012. He wrote, "Stay away from black men." Next to a white juror, he wrote, "KKK, good." Next to a black juror, he wrote, "Sensible, Uncle Tom type." That was somebody he wanted on the jury. Next to another juror, possibly KKK, good. "Keep off if can," he noted next to an unacceptable black juror. And then next to the last selection, I would say he wrote next to another juror, "Fine," underscored, "fine, probably KKK." So, with a hostile jury, with an eyewitness who had lied on the stand with the help of the district attorney, and with a judge who handicapped the defense and colluded with the prosecution, it was hardly a surprise that the Wilmington Ten were convicted and sentenced to a total of 282 years in prison for burning Mike's Grocery, for conspiring to burn Mike's Grocery, and for shooting at police and firefighters when they responded. So that's some of the background about the disturbance in Wilmington and the trial. And as often happened in our country's history, that might have been the end of it. It might have been that 10 people were sent to prison, their lives were ruined in order to make someone pay for what occurred in Wilmington, and they paid also to interrupt the development of a radical black nationalism, of which North Carolina was a center. So that might have been the end of it. And then people would have gone on their way, and that would have been it, except there would have been 10 people in prison serving 282 years. But as we know, that was not the end of it. The struggle continued, and it continued due to a couple of things. One, it continued because of the excellent legal counsel primarily from the law firm of James Ferguson and the late Julius Chambers. Ferguson and those under his direction and leadership persisted through the multiple stages of the appeals process in both state and federal courts. Yet, as North Carolina Central University law professor Irv Joyner, who was in the middle of the work of the Commission for Racial Justice in the 1970s, as Irv Joyner noted, even the best legal work by itself was not capable of securing justice for the Wilmington Ten. And for that to happen, the very radical movements that the federal and state governments sought to suppress had to be able to persist and thrive. As I said earlier, in North Carolina, the radical movement was personified by Ben Chavis and the Youth Organization for Black Unity, among others. Nationally, it was personified by the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which was aligned with the Communist Party of the United States. The danger these organizations posed in the authorities' eyes was not only in their radical critiques, although what used to be called consciousness raising and political education was vitally important. Rather, they were adept at linking their ultimate goals to a variety of local struggles. They were effective. They found allies among all sorts of persons, including African Americans who had never before been politicized, among black high school and college students, among white liberals like the Reverend W.W. Finlater, whose influence extended to causes that had traditionally been identified with progressive whites. And they also found allies among an emerging stratum of black elected officials and people who aspired to political office and entry into traditional politics. So you have this group of radicals who were trying to either radically alter or in some cases overthrow the system, working on a specific issue, freeing the Wilmington Ten, putting out their analysis of that issue, why the Wilmington Ten were framed, so on and so forth, and I'll get to that in a moment. And you had them coming into contact with and influencing people who had been elected to office, who were sworn to uphold the system. Even if they were working to reform it, they were working within the system. They were working in rather moderate ways. And so you had this connection here, and you had this group of radicals who was exerting that influence. And that, at bottom, is a major reason why you knew about the Wilmington Ten after their conviction, and why they didn't go away silently, and why the people who were opposed to their conviction didn't go away silently. The Wilmington Ten was a shocking example of political repression. It was so shocking that it became a tribune through which many other grievances were expressed. On a national level, that meant the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression was able to tap into a prisoners' support movement, circles of 1960s era radicals who continued to fight against Richard Nixon's abuse of power. They were able to tap into some labor unions that were looking to organize the South, and they were able to tap into a network of civil liberties-minded attorneys and elected judges. In North Carolina, the Commission for Racial Justice placed local organizing at the center of what it did. The Wilmington case brought together people who were demanding greater access to public higher education, an end to police brutality, reform of law enforcement, and on a world scale, the overthrow of apartheid, among other currents of dissent. And the anti-apartheid movement, for those of you who are not my age, say, North Carolina was an important center of the anti-apartheid movement. It was an important center of the movement to support the rebels in the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau. Because of the egregious political repression during the Nixon administration, even those who sought incorporation into the political system were open and even eager to join the ranks of the leftists and radicals on the Wilmington Ten and other issues. Joy Johnson, the second African American elected to the General Assembly in the 20th century, summed up matters this way in a speech to a conference. To those blacks who wish to work inside the system, ride on. To those who wish to work outside the system, right on. To those who favor violence, right on. To those who favor nonviolence, right on. To the integrationists, right on. To the non-integrationists, right on. To the young, right on. To the old, right on. To all of you, right on, if it means we work together in a spirit of unity. It was this spirit, this largeness of mind and purpose, a conscious decision not to retreat when opponents claimed that you were consorting with radicals and revolutionaries, that allowed the campaign to free the Wilmington Ten to advance. Politically, there were clear connections made among different fights for equality, beyond which different groups freely propagated their analyses and points of view. Practically, the major organizations devised a variety of activities for individuals to act on their consciences: signing and circulating petitions, attending and organizing community teach-ins and larger conferences, writing letters to the editor of local papers, attending a march, or participating in civil disobedience. There was something there for everyone. Whatever time you had to spare, whatever your level of commitment, if you wanted to free the Wilmington Ten at whatever level, there was something for you to do. And these organizations practically were able to organize that and tap into all levels of discontent. That, of course, was on the domestic front. Historically, one of the most effective tactics of the civil rights movement has been creating international pressure. The major organizations fighting to free the Wilmington Ten worked to build international solidarity. The clamor across the nation, combined with European agitation centered in both East and West Germany, created a huge problem for newly elected President Jimmy Carter, who had made human rights a central theme of his administration's foreign policy. The president frequently invoked Amnesty International to score propaganda points in the arena of world public opinion. But from the earliest days of his presidency, Carter was dogged by reporters about the Wilmington Ten. He tried to evade the issue by saying,